Imagine being a small manufacturer designing ideas so futuristic that the entire industry starts laughing. Imagine them bashing you for not understanding the idea. Now imagine a reputable manufacturer coming out with that same idea only to prove the market how wrong they were, while you knew that all along. Imagine being so ahead of the curve that most people will never understand you.
Now, if your name was Alvaro or Guido Vertemati, you wouldn't have to imagine. That was your life story. A story of passion, of engineering, and manufacturing perfection. A story of a corporate fallout in the quest for controlling their dream. This is the story of Vertemati and VOR Motorcycles.
The story of Alvaro and Guido actually goes back to the 80s, when the brothers became the official Husqvarna importers for the Italian market. When the Swedes got moved over to Cagiva's hands, the brothers switched teams and started selling Husabergs. The thing is, while dealing with dirt bikes paid the bills, their real passion lied in racing. The Vertematis started taking their Husabergs and modifying them, and they went so far as signing up for MXGP. Let me remind you, this was a team based in a shed somewhere in Italy. So when they started competing head-to-head with Husqvarna for the first place, back in 1993, the attention quickly shifted towards them. You see, the brothers had a little ace up their sleeves, and that ace had a name, Joel Smets. Because of financial reasons, Joel went to the Italian team run by the Vertemati brothers in order to allow him to keep competing. And also, that same year, those modified machines became a little too good. The thing is, technically, Husaberg was competing for top results. But at the same time, that Husaberg had a big Made in Italy sticker applied on it.
Long story short, the Swedish factory pushed back on that branding and left Vertemati with little to no choices. They had to build their own motorcycle. Look, the brothers had been toying with the idea of building their own bike for quite some time.
They had gone so deep into modifying the Bergs that this was the only possible way forward. And so, for 1994, Vertemati, together with Joel Smets, officially signed up for the championship. Out of the gate, the bike was fast, and so was Joel. The team could have easily won the World Championship back in '94. But in the end, they didn't. The harsh reality was that the Italian team was just too small. Racing on a one-off prototype, mechanical issues were bound to happen, and they did. Because of that, Joel had to DNF one too many times, and that cost them the title crown.
Don't get me wrong, for a first-year effort, that was outstanding. The thing is, nobody really cares or remembers who was in second.
The team could have taken this a step forward for the following year, but their lack of budget showed, as Husaberg outbid them and got Joel on their own factory team. This part of their story truly is bittersweet. On one hand, they got further up the ladder than anyone could have bet. On the other, they failed just inches away from the spotlight. Ultimately, what came out of this was one of the greatest stories in motorcycling history. The brothers never stopped working and developing their motorcycle, working tirelessly in their little Italian shop. They developed a racing prototype alongside Mike Young, and for what it's worth, this motorcycle didn't really lack any speed. What they did lack was commercial knowledge. When MXA got to test ride their first publicly available model, they described it as a train wreck. The thing is, when you look at those first Vertematis, you can see the work of a visionary. But visionaries often make some really questionable decisions. Unlike the decision to press that subscribe button. Cheers. Let's take the 1999 V503 for example. The brothers engineered a frame that would bolt together, allowing them to have finer control over the flex points of the chassis. The 500cc engine revved much lower than its competitors, but the extra capacity meant that it didn't exactly lack any drive. The brothers equipped this unit with a gear-driven camshaft and the backwards kickstarter. The entire swing arm was CNC machined from one solid piece of metal, featuring a unique I-beam design. The entire geometry made this motorcycle stable as a train in a straight line.
Fortunately, this also meant it steered a bit like a train. And then came the most controversial aspect, its gearbox. The cassette-style transmission only had 3 gears. Weird for the late 90s, a bit. But that was not the problem.
No, the Italians decided to reinvent the motorcycle shift pattern, putting neutral all the way down in the gearbox. When journalists got to have a go, they were initially deeply impressed with the smoothness of their bespoke unit. Until every single one of them accidentally hit neutral and crashed in a corner. In order to avoid losing all engine brake, you'd have to keep a constant mental count of the gear you're in, which made simply riding the Vertemati a less than trivial task. It's safe to say, for its time, this Vertemati dirt bike really was a pioneer, an engineering masterpiece, exotic in every single way. In fact, it was the Lamborghini of its days. But not the modern, reliable, dependable Lambos. This was the Countach, flamboyant, out of this world, but filled to the brim with compromise. Back in the late 90s, that was the true Italian style.
Ultimately, the press admired the effort, but those early bikes were hard to recommend, and even harder to build. The Italians had an allergy to mass production, some years allegedly yielding production numbers in the double digits only.
Really, the brothers loved racing. They loved the engineering, the design aspect of it. Mass producing the bikes? That was a different story. And here is where VOR came into play. Acronym for Vertemati Off-Road Racing. This business endeavor represented a commercial spin-off. Vertemati would do the interesting, cool part, and VOR would handle the production and selling of those bikes. The unit slowly transitioned to featuring both logos on their liveries. But as the two company names became more intertwined, the relationship between them was quickly falling apart. Look, this is a little speculative on my end, but people in charge of VOR wanted to build a real, proper motorcycle company. And I think the Vertemati brothers were more focused on the high-end, future-looking technologies. I think this fundamental perspective difference led the two entities into having a massive fall-off. The brothers quit any relationship with VOR as that side of the company was sold off, and the Italians went on to develop their Vertemati motorcycle.
VOR was left with a broken motorcycle concept and a dream. The company took the bike originally developed by the brothers and tried iterating on it, fixing all the glaring issues that had showed up.
Look, initially, these VORs were pretty much Vertemati clones, only with time did they evolve. The new company ended up reworking the radiators, fuel tank, linkage, suspension setups, exhaust, frames even. Looking back, there was no part left untouched in their attempt to salvage this dirt bike. And to be fair, it was working. The bikes got a new 5-speed gearbox, one that wouldn't make you crash by going into neutral by mistake. They added an e-start system, Behringer brakes, and updated WP suspension setup. Heck, the latest 04 models even came with fuel injection. VOR took a bike that was mostly a racing prototype and refined it to the point where it became actually pretty darn good. So good that, in fact, MXA praised these latest incarnations. I wish this was a happy ending story, but the reality is different.
Look, VOR did work a lot on their bikes, but the times had changed rapidly.
In a world where Yamaha hadn't released their 4-stroke YZs, these machines would have dominated. But that was not the real world. Look, going back to the Lamborghini analogy, these dirt bikes were still unique, bespoke, one of a kind. Which is cool to have as a museum piece, but for the average individual, they're oftentimes much better off with a Camry. Ultimately, all the changes VOR implemented came a little too late, and the company pretty much stopped selling machines by 2006. That was the end of the Vertemati story. Except, it wasn't.
Sure, the writing was on the wall for the old dirt bikes, but the family never stopped dabbling with motorcycles. Between 04 and 2012, They stopped competing at the highest levels. But they did work on unique one-off projects.
In 2009, the brothers came out with a unique single-cylinder design that twisted the exhaust at the rear. People laughed at it. It was weird. But when Yamaha did the same 1 year later, the same people also realized that it made sense. The brothers worked on a quad, on dedicated one-off race engines, and even built a custom-made twin-cylinder street bike for a customer. From 2013, Michael Vertemati, Guido's son, started competing in supermoto championships on their own motorcycles. With that, they kept publishing new features, CNC machine swing arms and parts. Basically, this family never stopped updating their old designs. They kept on trying to push their limits. They even went so far as building a full titanium frame.
That being said, ultimately, this was more of a hobby. If you look at their old social media posts, you'll see them advertising mechanic services for old dirt bikes.
It seems like they kept their small shop posting pictures of refurbished 125s and Honda engines. In a way, the future-looking Vertemati of old seemed to be gone. Not in spirit, but in scale and dreams. Then, as 2022 came around the corner, Alvaro Vertemati passed away.
It would be easy to mark this as the end of Vertemati. Half of it was gone forever. But somehow, this little shop in Italy managed to get another infusion of hope.
At the 2024 EICMA show, they announced a partnership with the Chinese manufacturer Nikot. If you've never heard of these guys, I don't blame you. In short, think of the most cliché Chinese motorcycle manufacturer. They build generic electric scooters, small e-bikes, and some cheaply made dirt bikes. With this in mind, at first I assumed this collaboration was a pure marketing stunt. Michael would get the funding to race the World Supermoto Championship, and Nikot get to slap their brand everywhere. Now, if that was the case, the 2024 season proved to be disastrous. The Vertemati team managing to only score 1 point throughout the season. And 2025 so far, it doesn't look much better. Look, Michael is a good rider. He won and scored well in multiple regional championships. But if marketing was the point, this investment kinda sucks.
What doesn't suck is our quick segue to tell you about our Patreon, where you can get updates on future projects in written form. Thanks for the support. Now, back to the video.
The thing is, marketing wasn't the only point. No, Nikot seemed to have something else. They came to the Italians for their engineering expertise. Apparently, Vertemati and Nikot are working together on future motorcycles that should be addressing the Western markets. The little Italian team would develop the machine in Italy, and the Chinese manufacturer would assemble it back in Asia. Then Vertemati could also become a European importer for the future Nikot motorcycles. Look, I get that maybe this is not exactly the glorious, happy ending we would have wished for.
But I'll be honest, given the state of the motorcycling industry, the alternative was slowly losing the Vertemati name. This way, maybe it gets a chance to live onwards. Maybe.
Even so, looking back, you can't deny how visionary the Vertemati brothers were. They were not afraid to experiment, to go against the grain. And to be fair, a lot of their designs actually did make sense. Up to a point.
I think history will look back and really appreciate their work. Sure, they were never mass-produced.
But just as my earlier Countach analogy, I don't think they had to. Sure, they had issues. But what they also had was an amazing story. Story that, one way or another, keeps on going forward while keeping it in the family. And there's something remarkably wholesome about that.
If you want to see other stories of failed bike companies, check out our Highland and Cannondale videos. Have a good one. Bye.